A Reasoned Defense for The Rise of Skywalker. Part 1, Introduction. I think The Rise of Skywalker is a better film than it gets credit for. I know it seems like everyone hates this film, but after I watched this movie in theaters and hated it, I began reconsidering, and eventually concluded this film really has some merit that deserves discussion. And after scouring YouTube and not finding anything close to a reasoned defense, I decided to just make one myself. I'm not going to argue that it's a masterpiece or a great film, but I do think by examining how it was positioned by previous films, what it aimed to accomplish, and how it went about accomplishing it, I believe this could help generate more respect for the film. To demonstrate this, I'd like to examine issues and dangling threads from episodes 7 and 8, use this to form a list of objectives that I think episode 9 likely would have had, and examine how well the film did based on those objectives. I'd also like to examine some common complaints about episode 9 through the same lens, and give my own opinion on whether these are valid. As a preface, I admit that I've spent a lot of time looking for reasons to like this film. I've been a Star Wars fan for a very long time. I grew up reading the Star Wars Expanded Universe, and I like all of the sequels and all Disney Star Wars at varying levels, and as such I actively want to like this film. Even so, I still hope to present a relatively unbiased analysis, and since I will also be discussing areas where I still think the film failed, I hope that will mitigate any concerns about this being a lopsided defense. Part 2, Leftovers. There are a number of issues left over from the previous two films in this trilogy that I think are worth discussing. Completing a story satisfactorily is always the goal of a third act, and completing a trilogy is always the goal of a third film, so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that The Rise of Skywalker would have aimed to resolve dangling threads from before. In addition, given some of the backlash from the previous films, it makes even more sense that the makers of this film would want to address many if not all of those issues. With that in mind, I want to discuss complaints and dangling threads from episodes 7 and 8. Not exhaustively, as some aren't relevant and some likely could not be changed, but many will be reflected here. Additionally, though I want to present these complaints in a mostly positive light, I'm not necessarily endorsing these complaints, merely presenting them as obstacles that episode 9 might want to overcome. Part 2.1. State of the Galaxy. It's hard to ignore that after 30+ years of waiting to see what happened after Return of the Jedi, and after having so much emphasis placed on the rise and fall of the Empire in episodes 1 through 6, that episodes 7 and 8 didn't do much in terms of explaining the state of the galaxy. Questions arise such as these. 1. What happened to the Empire after Ender? Did the Rebel Alliance become a new republic? 2. Who is this resistance, and what is their relationship to the old rebels and the new republic? 3. Who is the First Order, and what is their relation to the old Empire? How does the First Order work at such a scale if they aren't a universe-spanning empire? 4. Given that all the Sith were apparently defeated in Return of the Jedi, who is Supreme Leader Snoke? And why does the First Order follow him? Part 2.2. Rey. Rey is the central character of the sequel trilogy, and there has been a lot of conversation about problems with her characterization. 1. One common complaint is that Rey is greatly overpowered, especially for someone who has had no formal Jedi training. Some of what Rey is capable of as a Force user even in the first film, for example Jedi mind tricks, resisting Kylo Ren's mind probe, lightsaber prowess, defeating Kylo, etc. is surprising considering what the prequels seem to establish about Jedi training taking half of a lifetime to master. 2. Another complaint of the last two films is that Rey has essentially no character growth. She has a pure heart and does the right thing on Jakku all the way through to the end of 8 on Crate. She doesn't seem tempted by the dark side, or to have character defects to overcome, or any knowledge gaps where she needs to grow. 3. The last major complaint about Rey is her lineage. The question of where Rey came from was posed in The Force Awakens and was of interest to at least Rey, and seemingly also to the audience. Thus, Many found The Last Jedi's reveal that Rey came from nowhere to be the most disappointing answer possible to the question of Rey's lineage, and in stark contrast to the mystery presented in 7. Is there something Episode 9 could do to satisfactorily answer some of these concerns around Rey? Part 2.3. Original Characters. Given how beloved the characters from the original trilogy are, and how much built-up anticipation there was from so much waiting, there was always going to be high expectations for the characterization of Han, Luke, Leia, Chewie, Lando, C-3PO, and R2-D2. 1. Which is why it's surprising that there was not even one moment with the original trio together, not even a scene that could be used for a promotional shot. 30 years of waiting and these three hardly appear in the same movie together. Truly seems like a lost opportunity. 2. It's probably an understatement to say that many agreed with Mark Hamill's criticism of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. The galaxy's New Hope had become a hopeless broken man who considered murdering his nephew, abandoned the galaxy, and died from too much force. Again, I'm just repeating the criticism, not endorsing it. 3. Not everyone loved Han's portrayal or felt that his death was meaningful. 4. Many felt like Chewbacca was sidelined, particularly his not mourning Han with Leia at the end of The Force Awakens. 5. Many wondered what happened to Lando and why he hadn't appeared along with other original trilogy characters. 6. Some thought the classic droids were sidelined in favor of BB-8, C-3PO in both previous films, and both droids in The Force Awakens. Part 2.4. New Characters. The Force Awakens introduced many new characters such as Rey, Finn, Poe, and others. It seemed the general consensus for the new characters was approval. However, after The Last Jedi, many were disappointed with the treatment of those same characters. A few criticisms of the new characters stemming from Episode 8. 1. After 2 whole films, the sequel trio of Rey, Finn, and Poe were finally all in the same room for the first time only at the end of The Last Jedi. And for most of The Last Jedi and much of The Force Awakens, each character was in their own location. This means that for almost 2/3 of the trilogy, the main characters have been apart. This is a strong contrast to the original trilogy's Han, Luke, and Leia, whose shared screen presence formed the heart of A New Hope and the entire original trilogy. This is its own form of compliment. The fans like these new characters so much they want them all together. 2. As the primary and overarching villain of both the prequel and original trilogies, Palpatine's rise, reign, and fall paralleled the journey of the Republic, Empire, Anakin Vader, and the Jedi. In short, Palpatine was the driving force behind the conflict of the original 6 films. It came as a great surprise then when Supreme Leader Snoke was killed in the last third of The Last Jedi, especially given that The Force Awakens seemed to be building Snoke up to be playing a very similar role to Palpatine. Many asked what was his narrative purpose, since they weren't given an understanding of his rise, or that of the First Order, and in the first film he appears in besides a hologram, he was killed. 3. After what looked to be the introduction of a young, cold, capable, passionate, and twisted First Order leader, Episode 8 seemed to portray General Hux as a bit of a buffoon and mostly the butt of jokes. Perhaps these two portrayals could be reconciled, but many thought Hux to have been ruined by his appearance in The Last Jedi. 4. Having a former stormtrooper who left the First Order seemed to be an exciting new story angle for Star Wars to explore. So after his introduction in Episode 7, many felt that Finn's lingering lack of commitment to the Resistance was a retread of his journey in The Force Awakens. His mission to Canto Bight was unnecessary and pointless, his stormtrooper background had hardly been utilized, and the question of how Finn felt fighting the same force he was raised to defend was a question completely unasked. 5. While many loved the brash expert pilot from The Force Awakens, many thought the Poe of The Last Jedi was mostly bossed around, torn down, and treated with contempt unfitting of a leader and an expert pilot. 6. Not everyone loved the new character Rose Tico, who was introduced in The Last Jedi. whether due to her quest with Finn feeling pointless, what some thought was persistent nagging and tearing Finn down, or her final speech at the end of The Last Jedi, there were many who found Rose's characterization to be overall problematic. Part 2.5. Other issues. I am not going to list every other 7 and 8 complaint, but here are a few others that are relevant. 1. Many thought the previous 2 films were far too much like the original trilogy, specifically A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back. 2. Kylo Ren is a trained Jedi turned to the dark side. Why is he continually bested by Rey, a girl who never held a lightsaber before? 3. Many who thought the Knights of Ren could be an interesting idea, found them to be unexplained, unexplored, and unused. 4. For both sequences that involve destroying a superweapon, there's almost no planning involved. The planning that is in the films is introduced with little background research, is introduced in seconds, and almost as soon as it is introduced, it is acted on. This is in stark contrast to the destruction of both Death Stars in the original trilogy. In A New Hope, the quest for the Death Star plans is what drove most of the film, and a protracted sequence shows exactly how the plan works. And again in Return of the Jedi, while the capture of the plans is not a plot point, we are given a lengthy sequence showing exactly what the plan is, and how it will be accomplished. Could Episode 9 show proper planning before attacking a superweapon? 5. Additionally, in The Force Awakens, the planet-killing superweapon is introduced in the middle of the film, with zero build-up or anticipation, which significantly diminishes potential emotional impact when the weapon is eventually used. This is starkly contrasted by A New Hope, in which the weapon is introduced in the opening crawl and is the primary threat driving the entire film. This is also contrasted by Return of the Jedi, in which the second Death Star is shown in the opening crawl and opening scene. Could Episode 9 introduce its threat at the beginning of the film to properly set up the stakes for the film? 6. Regardless of the quality of visual spectacle, many questioned what ramifications the Holdo maneuver had for space battle in Star Wars going forward, and how it affects analysis of previous space battles. 7. While not a sequel trilogy issue, many fans were displeased with Disney's decision to decanonize the previous Star Wars extended universe of novels, comics, games, and etc. 8. This complaint may just be me, but The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi did not have nearly enough novel ship designs. I understand that as a legacy sequel, they wanted to use legacy ships and modified legacy ships, but I love Star Wars for the new ships. And these could be merchandising opportunities in the great legacy of Star Wars toys. Part 2.6. Dangling Threads. As the last film in the trilogy, a good finale would want to resolve any dangling threads from 7 and 8. And outside of complaints above, I think these are the major remaining plot points the film would want to resolve. 1. What is the final fate of the Resistance, First Order, and the galaxy at large in this conflict? Seems obvious, but someone needs to win and lose, and this needs to be climactic and complete. 2. Leia claimed the spark of hope had gone out of the galaxy just before Luke returned to face the First Order on Crait. Did his actions on Crait rekindle the spark of hope for the galaxy, as the last scene of The Last Jedi implies? 3. Will Kylo be redeemed? Many might have assumed that it is obvious that he will be, but given his ending in The Last Jedi, having killed his masters, embraced the dark, and having had the door shut on him by the last living person who believed in him, it was always possible he would die as the final villain of the sequels. But even if not, his redemption still has to be accomplished. 4. How will Rey's story end? Will she embrace the dark like Luke feared, or will she be able to rebuild the Resistance, defeat Kylo, and rebuild the Jedi Order? Will she even be able to rebuild Luke's lightsaber? Or will she have to construct something new, a new saber for a new order? 5. Why are Rey and Kylo so closely connected? Did Snoke really bridge their minds, or is there more to their connection? 6. Rey was shown to have the original Jedi texts at the end of The Last Jedi and is now the last of the Jedi. How will she use these texts, and will she begin what Luke failed in rebuilding the Jedi Order? 7. Finn went from being a stormtrooper, to a defector, to finally caring for another person in Rey during The Force Awakens, and from caring only to save his friend to being a true rebel by the end of The Last Jedi. How does Finn's journey end? 8. How will Poe embrace the mantle of leadership after going from hotshot pilot, to learning humility and becoming a true resistance leader, as shown in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi? 9. How will Leia's story end? Although each of the other two members of the original trilogy trio died at the end of the previous two films, and thus Leia's death seemed inevitable, the passing of Carrie Fisher was a real-life non-story event that made ending her story much more challenging. Part 3, Objectives. So we can see that Episode 9 had a lot that it would have wanted to accomplish in one film. I've summarized what I think would have been some goals for the story of Episode 9 to accomplish. 1. Complete the story of this trilogy and end the Skywalker Saga. 2. Tell a story that weaves this trilogy and the previous trilogies all into one narrative. 3. Have the new team together for this film. 4. Complete Rey's story in a way that makes Rey's training, character growth, lineage, and powers all fit together. 5. Redeem Kylo or otherwise close his story, show his true strength as a villain. 6. Better explain Rey and Kylo's connection. 7. Show how Rey begins the next steps of the Jedi Order and utilizes the original Jedi texts. 8. Continue Finn's journey from defector to friend to rebel to something new. 9. Continue Poe's journey as a leader of the Resistance. 10. Try to somehow rectify not having the original trio together. 11. Give Leia's story a proper ending and Carrie Fisher a fitting send-off. 12. Clearly demonstrate Luke's redemption from The Last Jedi. 13. Show that Han's sacrifice was not in vain. 14. Use the original droids and Chewbacca in a satisfactory way. 15. Incorporate Lando and any other original trilogy characters who did not appear previously. 16. Explain Snoke and the First Order's origin. 17. Give some sense of First Order politics and strategy. 18. Explain the Resistance-Republic distinction and their background. 19. Explain and use the Knights of Ren. 20. Give General Hux a satisfying story ending. 21. Include Rose satisfactorily. 22. Show more proper battle planning. 23. Confirm that the Holdo maneuver doesn't destroy space combat. 24. Incorporate elements of the old expanded universe. 25. Continue the long tradition of cool new ships. 26. Tell a good story that celebrates Star Wars, and doesn't kill the family dog in the last episode. Part 4, Episode 9. So how did Episode 9 do? Did it accomplish everything we thought it might have set out to? Did it accomplish it well? Here I'd like to discuss what the film did accomplish, as well as motifs, lore references, and cool stuff, and I'll feed these views into the later discussion around shortcomings. In this section I'm going to get into some more subjective assertions, especially around things I liked, so listener beware. Part 4.1. Themes. I'll argue The Rise of Skywalker had at least 4 major themes: healing, resurrection, overcoming your past, and good is not alone. I sometimes call these motifs and not themes because sometimes I feel like they are not expressed strongly enough to call themes, but they do show up all over the film, and I suspect they were intended as themes. And I think discussing these themes helps understand some of the narrative flow of the film and may help mitigate later criticism. I'm mainly aiming to point out recurrences, but I'll also argue for some deeper meaning. Part 4.1a, Healing. Healing shows up a lot in this film. 1. Mustafar is healing itself at the outset of this film. 2. Rey and Leia have done something to heal Luke's lightsaber that was split in two in the last film. 3. Kylo decides to heal his mask he destroyed in the previous film. 4. Rey uses Force healing to heal the snake in the Pasana cave. 5. BB-8 heals the droid D0 on Jimmy. 6. While the fiery confrontation of Revenge of the Sith invoked images of destruction and burning, Rey fights Kylo over the waters of Endor, invoking imagery of healing. 7. Rey heals Kylo after nearly killing him on Endor. 8. Han's final scene is of relational healing with his son. 9. Palpatine steals the Dyad's life force to heal himself. 10. Kylo gives his life to heal Rey. 11. The final battle shows the galaxy unwilling to bear the yoke of the Empire again, arguably a healing itself. The galaxy has been healed of its tolerance for Palpatine's empire. But does the healing represent more? Is the healing symbolic of healing of the conflict begun in the Phantom Menace, now happening throughout the galaxy, that Rey and the Resistance have brought about? Or healing the 1,000-year wound of the Sith Scourge? Is it a picture of the healing in the Star Wars fan base this film was trying to achieve? Is it just a picture of Rey and Kylo's healing at the end of their arcs? Is it imagery of resurrection? I don't know, but I do think healing is all over this film. Part 4.1b, Resurrection. Many have pointed out the number of fake deaths in this film: Chewie, C-3PO, Rey, Kylo, even Palpatine is like a fake-out death from Return of the Jedi. But for many if not most of these, fake-out death is not the right term. These are resurrections or rebirths. 1. Palpatine is like a resuscitated corpse of the Emperor we knew from Return of the Jedi, with his fleet of Star Destroyers as if they are rising from a frozen grave on the tomb-ridden planet of Exegol. 2. Endor is like a grave or corpse of an old war. 3. Kylo Ren must die over the healing like waters, so that Ben Solo can be resurrected in Kylo's place. 4. Palpatine is again resurrected from his putrefaction into the quote one true Emperor and claims that quote the Sith are reborn. The Jedi are dead. Before his final defeat. 5. Rey, reborn and reintroduced as a Palpatine, must die in defeating Palpatine and her lineage, to finally be reborn as a Skywalker. 6. Which makes me think that Chewie and C-3PO, rather than having fake-out deaths, are almost symbolic foreshadowings of the deaths and resurrections to come. 7. Even the healings mentioned could be seen as resurrections. D0 and the Pasana snake were servants of evil, but their healing brings them to help the good guys, almost like they were reborn. 8. It's arguable that the First Order is on the verge of being reborn as the Final Order, but the Rebellion, reborn as Luke Skywalker said in The Last Jedi, overthrows Palpatine and the Sith. 9. Could we argue that Poe is reborn from Spice Runner to Leader, Finn from Stormtrooper to Resistance General and Force Acolyte, and Hux reborn as a spy but then just dies? No rebirth for that villain. Probably a stretch for these, but worth considering. Is all this just a completion of Rey and Kylo's arc? Is this the continuation of Luke Skywalker's prophecy that the Rebellion is reborn? Is this indicating the rebirth of the Jedi Order in the galaxy? Is this symbolic of the resurrection and rebirth of the Star Wars franchise at the end of the Skywalker Saga? Or just the resurrection of the sequels and of JJ's original plan from before The Last Jedi? Only joking. Indeed, resurrection and rebirth are throughout this film. Part 4.1c, Overcoming the Past. Early in the film, Leia tells Rey to never be afraid of who you are. This line is repeated in a mocking way by Dark Rey in her vision inside the wreckage of the Emperor's throne room on Endor. Repeated lines ought to make the audience consider their significance, and for Rey, never be afraid of who you are raises an important question. Who is Rey? Is she Rey Palpatine, descendant and heir of the greatest of the Sith? Or is she something else, a true heir of the redemption of the Skywalker line? The same question is implied for many of the main characters of this film. Is Poe a spice smuggler, or the leader of the Resistance? Is Finn an ex-stormtrooper, or is he a Force-sensitive Resistance general? Is Luke still the hopeless recluse, or has he learned he was wrong and become a mentor to Rey as Obi-Wan and Yoda were to him? Is Hux a traitor or not? Will Zori Bliss follow Poe and leave Spice running and join the Resistance? Whether it's by blood, like Rey and Kylo, or by past decisions like Poe, Finn, Luke, Hux, Zori, and even D-Zero, all choose to embrace the righteous path of the light in spite of their past. This echoes another motif of this film in that all of these are forms of rebirths for these characters, and I'd ask similar questions again. Is this just a continuation and completion of these characters' arcs? Is this a continuation of Kylo saying to let the past die? Is this about the franchise overcoming its past? Is this the galaxy and the Jedi Order overcoming the past wounds of the Sith and Palpatine? Again, I don't have answers, but overcoming the past as a form of rebirth is throughout this movie. Part 4.1d, Good is never alone. Another idea repeated 3 times in the film is this. The combination of we're not alone and or there are more of us, one or both said by Zori Bliss, Poe, and Lando. This is communicating the idea that it is the good guys who are never alone and are truly in the majority. When Poe expresses his fears on Pasaana that no one will come to help the Resistance, just like no one came on Crate, Zori reminds him, quote, "They win by making you think you're alone, but there's more of us." Later, when the Resistance thinks no one will join them in the fight against the Final Order at Exegol, Poe reminds them that, quote, "We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them." And finally, when all seems lost and the Resistance are massively outnumbered during the battle over Exegol, when Poe says in desperation, quote, "There's just too many of them," Lando arrives with a Dunkirk-like fleet of small ships and reminds Poe there are more of us. This last moment probably feels like a payoff without much setup, but it still makes me smile. As if Elijah's 7,000 had showed up all at once, or like when the dead men of Don Harrow show up to help the men of Minas Tirith. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is nearly as good as that, but it is what Tolkien would call a eucatastrophe, and it feels good. And this showed that good was indeed never alone. Good people showed up to fight because the Resistance led them and successfully lit the spark of, well, resistance, and reignited hope in the galaxy. I think this shows up even in the actions of both sides. The First Order seems consistently at odds with itself, with ongoing infighting among factions, continually isolating individuals, and becoming more and more alone. Whereas the Resistance is shown working together, building each other up, working through differences, and never working alone. And since the Resistance successfully relit a spark of fighting spirit in the galaxy, this could be said is the rebirth of hope, which would make this just another resurrection. Part 4.1e, Themes Conclusion. And maybe this makes all 4 of these themes just one theme, and this entire movie about one thing, rebirth. 1. All the healings become a form of rebirth. 2. All the resurrections are rebirths. 3. Overcoming the past is a form of rebirth. 4. Relighting a spark of resistance in the galaxy is its own form of rebirth. The rebirth of hope. Part 4.2. Accomplishments. Now let's talk about what the Rise of Skywalker accomplished compared to what we proposed it might have aimed to accomplish. Part 4.2a, The Emperor's Return. This is by far the most controversial story element of Episode 9, but let's look at what is accomplished by bringing back Palpatine. 1. Although it's arguable that the fight against the First Order is a sufficient common thread for this trilogy, this film asserts that Palpatine, who has returned in a clone body, was the one who made Snoke, and that his final order will complete the work of the First Order in reconquering the galaxy. Because we also know from The Force Awakens that the First Order also arose from the unknown regions, what this implies is that Palpatine had been building a backup force in the unknown regions even before his death. The new canon makes this explicit, and that the First Order led by Snoke was the first wave in his plan, while he completed the final preparations of the Final Order. Thus bringing back Palpatine made his trilogy's purpose to be the defeat of Palpatine's backup plan in the unknown regions, and this third trilogy became about the final defeat of Palpatine. who rose in the prequels, reigned and fell in the originals, and almost rose again in these sequels, which also connects all three trilogies together. 2. Bringing back Palpatine allows Rise of Skywalker to end the Skywalker Saga. This is true for multiple reasons. 2.1. With the passing of Anakin Skywalker in Episode 6, and Luke Skywalker in Episode 8, Leia and Ben Solo represented the last of the Skywalker bloodline. With their passing in this film, the Skywalker familial bloodline is no more, and thus the saga of the Skywalker family could be said to be ended. 2.2. The struggle between Skywalkers and Palpatines was finished. Because the story impetus of the original two trilogies revolved around the complex relationship of Palpatine and the Skywalkers, with the end of Palpatine and all his backup plans, the Skywalker Saga could be said to be ended because the dyad of Skywalker and Palpatine finally defeated the Emperor. 2.3. Because Palpatine represented all the Sith on what appears to be the last Sith redoubt of Exegol, the Skywalker dyad of Ben Solo and Skywalker trained Rey, effectively ended all the Sith. This could be argued as the true legacy of the Skywalkers. The defeat of the last Sith Lord and Palpatine. 3. Rey's lineage and character growth were at the center of the plot of Episode 9, but much of this is driven by the plot point that she is a Palpatine. The film opens with her training under Leia, but reveals that she doesn't complete even this course due to her impatient frustration. The film goes on to show her realization of her own inner demons, both in her visions of herself on the Dark Throne, to her use of Force lightning in order to defeat Kylo Ren. And when the film reveals that she is a descendant of the Emperor, she considers abandoning the fight to hide on the first Jedi Temple planet H2, much like Luke Skywalker in the previous film. It is Luke Skywalker himself who tells her that confronting fear such as her own is the destiny of the Jedi, and when she goes to face her grandfather, it is Palpatine who reveals that their powerful connection is due to being a dyad in the Force, not because Snoke bridged their minds, and he tempts her to save her friends by joining the dark side. Throughout this film, Rey is a real character with real weaknesses she has to overcome. And this reveal regarding her lineage and the nature of her dyad with Kylo Ren helps explain her rapid progress acquiring Force abilities and her prominence in the story. Does this prove she is not a Murisu? Maybe not for everyone, but it certainly looked like an effort to show this was not the case. 4. The origin of Snoke, and of the First Order, was also something that connected to the return of Palpatine. As already discussed, though it's not said expressly in the film, it appears that the Emperor had a backup solution waiting in the wings for some time, and both Snoke and the First Order appeared to be placeholders until Palpatine and the Final Order came to full strength. Like a blitzkrieg while the final solution is put into place. Though I'm not sure answering these questions in the final film of the trilogy would ever feel natural and not tacked on. This feels like a real attempt to give the trilogy a coherent backstory that ties the trilogy together with the rest of the franchise. Additionally, Palpatine's return is the catalyst for the few short scenes in The Rise of Skywalker that try to give some sense of First Order politics and strategy. Primarily, there is a discussion between Kylo, Hux, Pride, and the First Order Council in which we are told that the First Order has not yet completed its conquest of the galaxy, and some feel the First Order lacks the sense of being a true empire, which is what we'd expect given Rey's comment in The Last Jedi that the major systems would be conquered in mere weeks. This in the presence of the Knights of Ren also gives some sense of the discord between the military arm of the First Order and the new Supreme Leader, Kylo Ren, as Kylo appears fully supportive of Palpatine's plan, while at least one unnamed council member appears skeptical of the Sith cultists. This also gives Palpatine's offer serious strategic weight, as it would certainly tip the balance of power towards the First Order. I think it would have been a much more interesting story if both sides had been racing to find something which could have been just enough to tip the scales one way or the other, like the Katana fleet, rather than a fleet planet killers, but I'll take this. 5. Additionally, most of the expanded universe lore references in the film are based around the return of Palpatine. 5.1. Palpatine being cloned is an idea straight out of Dark Empire, as is the idea of his transferring his essence into clone bodies. Though I hate it in both places, as is the Empire and Darkseid followers retreating and following the Emperor's backup plan. Although George Lucas apparently did not like the idea of Palpatine's return in Dark Empire enough that he stayed more involved in vetoing expanded universe ideas ever after. 5.2. It's never said expressly, but I think there's an argument to be made that this Palpatine is an insane clone, much like Jaruzi both in the Thrawn trilogy. This would circumvent the stupidity of soul transference, explain why Palpatine is more like a cackling villain from a cartoon than a conniving political genius, explain why his plan sometimes seems ridiculous, reference a similar idea in expanded universe lore, and let me hand-wave anything inconsistent Palpatine does. 5.3. The idea of an extended Sith presence deep in the unknown regions is an idea straight out of Tales of the Jedi, Knights of the Old Republic, and or the Old Republic. The initial Sith attack in the Golden Age of the Sith comes from the unknown regions. Revan fled to the unknown regions to find the Sith stronghold in Knights of the Old Republic 2, and the Sith retreating to the unknown regions to rebuild, mirrors what kicks of the story of the Old Republic. Even the Sith redoubt of Exegol looks like a mix of the dark stormy Dromund Kaas with the graveyard monuments of Korriban. 5.4. Palpatine having another planet killer is an idea with so many expanded universe lore references. The World Devastator is from Dark Empire, the Galaxy Gun from Dark Empire 2, the Sun Crusher from Jedi Academy, Centerpoint Station from the Corellian trilogy, the Darksaber and not the Mandalorian one from the eponymous novel, etc. Not to mention in film canon references like the second Death Star, Starkiller Base, and miniaturized Death Star tech. 5.5. Having a previously unknown fleet hiding in the unknown regions that could change the outcome of the war, that both sides are racing to find in the final story of the trilogy, is somewhat reminiscent of the Katana fleet from the Thrawn trilogy. While true that in the case of the Katana fleet it was an unmanned fleet that either side could utilize, and that fleet was just enough to tip the balance in the war and not a super laser-equipped fleet where quote each ship is a planet killer, I don't think the parallels are accidental. Part 4.2b, Sequel Closure Accomplishments. 1. The Rise of Skywalker ended the story of the galactic conflict of the sequel trilogy. I won't argue here whether this was the best way to end this story, but the Resistance defeated the First and Final Orders in a last battle, and the First and Final Orders were overthrown across the galaxy by its denizens. And one thing the ending of this film demonstrated more than the ending of Return of the Jedi, although very briefly, is that it is indeed an uprising happening all over the galaxy. Not only has Lando recruited ships from what are likely planetary sector defense fleets from all over, but the uprisings are shown to be happening all over, with Bespin, Endor, and Jakku being specifically shown. I would argue that this is a satisfactory end to the conflict started in The Force Awakens, at least at a plot level. The Resistance successfully lit the spark, and thus the galaxy rose up to ensure that they would not let Palpatine and his resurgent Empire rule again. Although you could say this was the inevitable end of the third film, it still counts as an accomplishment. 2. One thing that is generally agreed on that The Rise of Skywalker did well, even amongst critics of the film, is having the sequel team of Finn, Poe, and Rey adventure together. From the opening scene of Finn and Poe on a mission to receive a transmission from a First Order spy, to the interactions of all three when first returning to Ajan Kloss, to the promo shot-worthy scene of them together in the Falcon's cockpit, all the way through Pasaana, Jimmy, and Endor, to Finn and Poe planning the attack on Exegol, to the final scene of the three tearfully celebrating the end of the conflict. The character interactions between the three as they journeyed together were one of the highlights of the film and felt like genuine chemistry between real characters. 3. Kylo was redeemed as a character in that he chose to embrace the path of the light, although this was also likely considered inevitable. It is the final sacrifice of Leia trying to reach her son one last time that distracts Kylo long enough so that Rey can bring about Kylo's death, But it is also Leia's sacrifice that inspires Rey to heal Ben, which brings about Ben's resurrection, and it is the vision-like memory of Han's sacrifice that completes the redemption of Ben Solo as he does what he could not in The Force Awakens and casts aside his twisted saber forever. And I think this scene and its imagery deserve some credit as a subtle reference to Anakin from Episode 3, rather than love being what pulls Kylo to the dark side amidst the fiery waves of Mustafar. It is love that restores Ben from the dark amidst the watery wreckage of the weapon that Anakin's decisions wrought. And although cheating death in this film is a dark side corruption as seen in Palpatine, saving loved ones from dying is a power through healing that comes from the light. And we get to see Ben Solo as a redeemed man fighting for what's right before his end, which is nice as that was not shown before this film. 4. I think the dyad in The Force is a much more elegant solution to why Kylo and Rey were drawn together, along with the Palpatine-Skywalker connection, rather than the idea that Snoke quote bridged their minds. The idea that the Force has made two that are one for its own purposes is an element of mystery and unknown, like the Force is bringing balance by its own means. Whereas Snoke bridging their minds is mentioned in one line, seems like an offhand comment, and is kind of an odd way to bring Rey to his throne. The dyad explanation makes Rey and Kylo's connection integral not only to the plot of this film, but to the plot of the entire trilogy, as it is the Force bringing them together specifically to save Ben and finally destroy Palpatine, and in all this, it almost adds a layer of meaning to the title The Force Awakens, as the Force is awakening Rey and the dyad for this purpose. And along with Rey's Palpatine lineage, the dyad idea also helps explain Rey's quick progression of power. She and Kylo are one in the Force somehow, thus as the dark in Kylo rises, so rises the light in Rey to meet it, and it flows nicely out of the scene where Kylo probes Rey's mind and seems to awaken the Force within. 5. I think Kylo demonstrates much more of his full capabilities as a swordsman in his battle with Rey on Endor, as here Kylo is in full strength emotionally and physically. It only seems right that after training at the hands of Luke Skywalker, and then under Snoke, that Kylo would far outclass Rey as a swordsman. And as this fight continued, Rey clearly lacked the skill and stamina to keep fighting. It's apparent toward the end that Kylo is merely batting off her exhausted haymakers as he expressly does not want to kill her, and it's only Leia's last plea distracting Kylo that gives Rey a chance to defeat him. I think this just reinforces why Kylo lost to Rey in The Force Awakens. He was wounded, emotional, and the fight was ended prematurely by the collapse of the planet. The untrained novitiate Rey cannot maintain a longsword duel with the trained Kylo Ren. 6. The portrayal of General Hux in this movie is probably considered more serious, and his actions are consequential and integral to the film's story. As a direct consequence of Kylo Ren's treatment of Hux in the last film, Hux chooses to betray Kylo Ren by becoming the spy that kicks off the Resistance storyline in this film. The addition of Allegiant General Pryde not only further shows the internal politics and divisions inside the First Order, it also shows that the consequences from the previous two films have cost General Hux his reputation and that he is clearly no longer trusted and respected, thus his hatred for Kylo Ren caused him to betray the First Order. This is a pivotal point again when saving the heroes from certain death during their hasty Star Destroyer rescue, which action would cost him his life. I'm sure this doesn't fix every complaint, as it doesn't restore him to the fearful figure The Force Awakens implied he might have been. Although I should say I enjoyed the portrayal from The Last Jedi, and I still think this is a nice through-line even for me, but I think others might say this does take his character more seriously and tries to make the last film serious by treating its consequences with appropriate gravity. 7. Poe Dameron's character began as a hotshot pilot in The Force Awakens, and in The Last Jedi essentially went through a journey from mere pilot to resistance leader, but his decisions were deemed by some to be of little consequence in that film. So in The Rise of Skywalker, Poe begins as the leader and pilot of the mission to retrieve the communique from the First Order spy, and it's Poe who continues as Leia's right-hand man as he leads the mission to find the Wayfinder with our heroes. Poe expresses doubts about his own leadership, Unc Jimmy saying that like no one came at Crate, so no one will help now, which echoes the film's motif that good people will follow. This comes to a head on Ender when Poe admits to Finn that he is no Leia, with which Finn heartily agrees. Upon Leia's passing, it's Poe who becomes the leader of the Resistance, and through Lando's wisdom and Finn's counsel, Poe rises to the occasion to lead the Resistance to the battle above Exegol, which finally lights the spark of resistance across the galaxy, resulting in the overthrow of the First Order everywhere. I will admit the backstory of him being a spice runner before joining up isn't necessary, but it is in keeping with the motif of the film that your past doesn't define you, and his arc about believing the galaxy has lost hope is in keeping with Leia's sentiments from The Last Jedi, completing the idea that the Resistance lit the spark, and in keeping with the motif that there are indeed more of us. And at least at the plot level, this feels like a completion of his journey. 8. Rose's role was significantly reduced in The Rise of Skywalker. I don't know if this was due to other story needs or in response to criticism, but it certainly addressed some critics, and I'm more or less fine with this. I didn't hate Rose in The Last Jedi, but I also recognize that not every character can stay central to the plot. I'm glad she was still there. It was nice to keep the continuity. 9. One thing The Rise of Skywalker does from very early in the film is establish the threat that the Resistance will be facing: Palpatine and his massive fleet of Star Destroyers. While it's not clear from the beginning that they are all equipped with planet-destroying weapons, it is at least clear from the initial communique from the spy that the Emperor is preparing to deploy a massive fleet. Which means when it is revealed that the fleet can destroy planets, this serves to increase the threat rather than merely establish it. Another accomplishment this achieves is that once this threat is communicated to the Resistance, Rose begins studying the specs of old Star Destroyers in preparation, and when this is paired with information from D0, who had genuine intel from Exegol, and Rey's course markers from traveling through the Red Cloud, the Resistance is able to plan their attack on the sensor that is guiding the Final Order fleet in a way that feels organic to the plot. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it doesn't feel like it comes from nowhere like Starkiller Base, and with no setup or plot antecedent, like the intelligence on planning to destroy Starkiller Base. 10. The Rise of Skywalker did try briefly to address concerns about the Holdo maneuver. Yes, it was only one line. Quote, that move was 1 in a million, but this does communicate that such attacks aren't normative. I think the new expanded universe has better answers. Something like the maneuver might send shards through hyperspace to numerous unknown destinations and could destroy planets and block hyperspace lanes for decades. But this deserves some credit for trying to explain that the Holdo maneuver didn't fundamentally alter space combat. 11. The Rise of Skywalker also incorporates the Knights of Ren into the story. They do look kinda cool, and they do further the impression that Kylo Ren will lead the First Order on his own terms, which indicates some further division between the military and the mystical elements of the First Order. The Knights of Ren weren't particularly integral to the story, and who they are, and what they are, still wasn't explained, nor exactly why they fought Kylo at the end. For all we know, why wouldn't they have followed Kylo Ren into their light? Are they loyal to Kylo, or are they committed to the dark side? Are they loyal to Palpatine, or are they members of the Sith Eternal? We just aren't told. I'd also say they went out pretty easily, although they put up more fight than most non-Force users, but they were present and looked kinda cool, and their fight was kind of fun to watch, and they had their own ship which also looked kinda cool. So I count that as an accomplishment. 12. The Rise of Skywalker did introduce some new ships. Granted, only a couple, the Knights of Ren and Ochi's new ships, and they aren't really framed very clearly for very long. But I thought they were generally cool looking, and I'm glad they tried, because I love new ships in Star Wars.L. I was sad no one made a toy version of either one, but that's a separate issue. 13. The Rise of Skywalker did use the Jedi texts, as Rey is studying them as a part of her training, as well as Luke's notes from his attempt to rebuild the Order. I love the idea that Rey is going back to the sources, which could set the stage for something like a reformation of the Jedi Order. This could also be a potential explanation for new ideas and powers in Rise of Skywalker such as dyats, healing, etc. As Rey is going back to some of the early teachings of the Jedi, which could well contain many teachings long forgotten by the Jedi of the prequel era. I wish we'd seen more of the direction of the new Jedi, but I'll accept this. And maybe this is how she was able to heal Luke's lightsaber, echoing the motif of healing Part 4.2c, original trilogy and other accomplishments. 1. Carrie Fisher's unexpected passing in 2016 was always going to present difficulties for Episode 9. But since the previous two films essentially served as swan songs for Han and Luke respectively, and Episode 9 was almost certain to do the same for Leia, this made her passing even more difficult for this film. Additionally, the decision was made at a corporate level that they would respect Carrie Fisher's legacy by not recasting or using deepfake technology. Some have mentioned that it would have been more respectful to Carrie Fisher's memory and legacy to recast and finish Leia's story, but I'm interested in discussing is what this film accomplished with the hand it was dealt, including decisions about required cast. Thus Episode 9 told Leia's final story by making use of archival footage, flashbacks, and by incorporating the effects of Leia's actions deeply into the plot. And all considered, I think both Leia's story and portrayal were acceptably handled. The footage of General Leia did seem uncanny at times, like Tarkin from Rogue One, and her lines did feel vague like the dialogue was written around her limited outtakes, but given the limitations, I think this felt acceptable. And with part of her story told through training Rey, callbacks to her statements like never underestimate a droid on Pasaana, the flashback of her training with Luke, and the impact of her death on Rey and Ben, I think this made the character feel even more present than her actual screen time would suggest. It's not the best way to tell a story, but I think it worked well enough under the circumstances. 2. Luke Skywalker's characterization in The Rise of Skywalker was much more hopeful and optimistic than the grim isolationist of The Last Jedi. I don't think retconning the events of the previous film was ever an option, nor was giving Luke as central a story as the previous film is a sort of do-over. Thus it makes sense to give us Force Ghost Luke, return to teach Rey from his own failures. While some thought Luke telling Rey that a Jedi's weapon deserves more respect is a shot at the previous film, I think this is merely a continuation of Luke's journey from The Last Jedi. In this film, Luke admits to Rey that quote, "I was wrong" regarding his actions that led up to The Last Jedi, so Luke rebuking Rey for throwing away the lightsaber is also a repudiation of his throwing away the lightsaber in The Last Jedi. Even as Luke's actions in facing down the entire First Order with a laser sword in The Last Jedi was itself a repudiation of his actions in that film. So this film gives us a Luke much more like the original trilogy simply by continuing Luke's arc from the last film. I kind of think anything else would have felt forced and even more like a retcon. 3. Harrison Ford's appearance in this film was a pleasant surprise. Some thought Han Solo's death was meaningless in The Force Awakens. Whether or not that's true, I think this one scene adds to its significance by showing what a profound and lingering impact Han Solo's death had on Kylo Ren. Since Kylo Ren says this is only a memory, this means it's a memory that has lingered with him for years, and even then has such a profound impact years later that it's this memory that finally pushes him back to the light. But I think it's arguable, especially since this memory is triggered by Leia's last words from across the galaxy and Rey's Force healing, that this is something like a Force vision of this moment from Han's perspective and not just merely a memory. And if this is a vision of Han's death from his own perspective, I think his confidence in his own actions is an implication that he knew his actions would have a deep impact on his son, so Han may have known it was not in vain. And because it is Leia's death that triggers the sequence leading to Kylo's dream memory vision, this again helps carry the feeling that Leia is deeply involved in this story without showing Carrie Fisher. And Han saying "I know" in reference to The Empire Strikes Back is pretty great. 4. This is the only sequel film that has the original trilogy trio together with speaking roles, and I'm still a little mad at The Force Awakens about this. While they aren't all present together in a scene in this film, Carrie Fisher was only present via archive footage, and both Han and Luke are essentially ghosts. They are still all here in this film, and that's a lot more than The Force Awakens did, though it had a lot more opportunity. 5. The story of C-3PO in this film was both humorous and heartfelt in my opinion, and was a touching end to the story of this lovable droid. Maybe not everyone thought his humor was funny, but I continue to laugh at his demeanor and dialogue when I rewatch this film. And his sacrifice, which is pivotal to the plot and to the Resistance victory, is something I found emotionally resonant. While it's true that his memory is later restored by R2-D2, and that his sacrifice does not happen with his original trilogy friends present, I still think it's touching. A behind-the-scenes story is that Anthony Daniels had been asking for a heroic moment for C-3PO for many years, with George Lucas saying no, but I'm glad he got it in what is likely Anthony Daniels' final Star Wars film, and between this and R2-D2 in The Last Jedi, I was pleased to see our old droid friends well portrayed for what may be their final outings. 6. Chewbacca was indeed very present in this film, and his actions integral to the plot. Though I know there were complaints about Chewbacca's fake death and his receiving a medal at the end of the film, I'd say this. His fake death demonstrates the team's love for Chewbacca through the team's mourning and rescuing him. It makes his rescue plot necessary to recover the dagger, and it reinforces the resurrection theme throughout the film. And the medal he receives, I'm pretty sure, was Leia's, and is another demonstration of his love for Han and Leia, alongside his mourning when learning of Leia's death, which is in contrast to his lack of mourning in The Force Awakens. Not calling it perfect, but I think the film is trying. 7. Lando. It's nice to see him in this trilogy and still charming, and Billy D. Williams seems genuinely happy to be in the film. Does his introduction come out of nowhere and feel rushed? Kind of. Does he do much in the film? Well, it's said, not shown, that he recruits the galaxy to fight at Exegol, and he encourages Poe to lead after Leia's death, and encourages Finn and Poe and the Resistance into action at the end. But no, we don't see him do much, though it's still pleasant to see him again. And nice to see Wedge too, even if it's just for a brief glimpse. Maybe cameos like this are pure fan service, but I enjoyed both. 8. Celebrating the Star Wars ethos and telling a fun story that doesn't kill any family dogs in the last episode is something so strong in this film that it's almost a motif. Does the film move at a lightning pace sometimes? Sure, but it's trying to tell a fun adventure tale. Should the film have been more serious? Maybe, but it wants you to enjoy this last journey and have fun. Were the fake deaths necessary? Maybe not, but they were in line with the film's motifs, and I'd guess they didn't want to kill fan favorites on the last outing. Does the film incorporate and celebrate the whole saga, including the prequel trilogy? Not really. It's clearly much more focused on looking and feeling like the original trilogy, although Palpatine's presence is a form of prequel continuity, as is ending the Sith forever. That said, I think there's a reference in the Pasana dessert that clues us into what this film really wants to accomplish at an emotional level. C-3PO states that the celebration on Pasana happens only every 42 years, and 42 years before this film came out in 2019 is when A New Hope was first released. I think this movie really wanted to capture the magic and lightning of that first film. And with that in mind, I can at least say this. This film can be a fun ride. Part 4.3. Cool stuff. Now I want to talk about stuff in this film that either looks cool, sounds cool, or is otherwise just cool in my opinion. I'm not defending Objections just yet, and this section is gonna be more of a fast-paced lightning round and even more subjective, so buckle up. 1. This movie looks great. The cinematography, the real-life settings, the sets, the stunts, the costumes, the CG, All looks really cool. Turn it on mute and just admire how cool it looks. 2. The movie sounds great. The soundtrack is beautiful and the sound effects are spot on. All around a great sounding movie. Just turn off the screen and listen. 3. Light speed skipping looks cool, foregoing any discussion of whether it makes sense. 4. Exegol looks cool and dark and twisted and kinda like Korriban mixed with Dromankas, and the Emperor looks like a walking corpse. Cool. 5. The Star Destroyers coming up from under the ice look cool and fit with the theme of resurrection as they look like resuscitated corpses rising from their graves. 6. I liked seeing the Millennium Falcon run with a whole crew, even if Klaus doesn't have hands. I thought that was cool. 7. Seeing Leia's blockade run again was pretty cool. 8. The Kilo mask was always cool with its Revan-inspired looks, and the rebuilt one with the red veins like a kintsugi teapot is cool. 9. Having the whole team together is fun, and their fast-paced adventures are kinda cool. 10. The celebration on Pasaana is fun, as is the micro-chase through the desert, and the force healing of the snake looks cool. 11. Rey's desert fight with Kilo looks cool as did his new TIE Whisper. 12. The Knights of Ren's new ship and the Sith Hunter Ochi's ship looked pretty cool. 13. Jimmy with its Kurosawa Hidden Fortress influence looks cool. 14. Seeing John Williams make a cameo was pretty cool. 15. I thought Babu Frick and D-Zero were adorable and both made me smile. And D-Zero was voiced by the director, which is kinda cool. 16. I thought the Death Star remnants were one of the coolest visuals in the whole film. And the fight with Rey and Kilo on the remnants looks cool all by itself, with things like force-bending lightsabers, and the setting only amplifying how cool it was. 17. Dark Rey with her double-bladed lightsaber looked kinda cool. Not saying the scene totally worked, but it looked cool. 18. The scene with Han and Ben was golden. And Ben saying quote Dad, and Han responding with just quote I know is a touching callback to The Empire Strikes Back. 19. Luke's line quote confronting fear is the destiny of the Jedi I thought was cool. It was cooler in the trailer with the trailer music, but I still really liked it in the film. 20. The trailer music that does a key change with the original Star Wars music still gives me chills. I thought it was really cool. Could have been in the film, but still cool. 21. The fight scene flashback with Leia and Luke training is pretty cool, and it's another way that Leia was incorporated without Carrie Fisher. And pretty cool that Carrie Fisher's daughter was the body double for Leia in this scene. 22. Luke pulling the X-Wing from the water was a cool callback to The Empire Strikes Back. And with the exact same music, it almost felt like a completed arc for Luke. 23. The Force Dyad idea and the continued multi-location fights looked way cool. 24. C-3PO and his story was cool and funny and touching. 25. The practical explosion when Jimmy blew up looks pretty cool. 26. The uprising to throw off the Final Order all over the galaxy was cool, and something not even Return of the Jedi did. Showing how the whole galaxy responded to the events of the film. 27. Seeing Wedge again, even so briefly, was pretty cool. 28. The voice cameo of all the Force ghosts at the end, hearing so many previous characters from other Star Wars media, was cool. I think a visual cameo would have been more satisfying all around, but I'll take what I can get. 29. Rey's staff saber in the yellow was a neat payoff to her journey from The Force Awakens, and the new color seems to indicate a new direction for her in the Jedi Order. 30. Rey becoming Rey Skywalker, though I know there's a really controversial elements of this story, and I don't know that the setup was all that well done, I still think is pretty cool as it concludes Rey's emotional journey surrounding her lineage. Embracing the lineage of the family who took her at every turn and rejecting the wicked lineage of her sires is a great way to end her story in my opinion. It would have been cooler if the New Order of Jedi were called Skywalkers, but again, I'll take what I can get. Part 5, Episode 9 Objections. In this section, I will air alleged grievances against this film. I'm gonna mention all the objections I've heard and I'll rebuff some, agree with some, and add some more that I've not heard but are fair. I will try to represent the arguments I've heard as fairly as I can. All Iron Manning and no straw manning if I can help it. Part 5.1. Objections listed. I'll go through these objections in brief list form here and in more depth when I try to rebuff or agree with them. 1. The Rise of Skywalker is a cheap-sounding title. 2. The dead speak is a ridiculous first line. 3. Palpatine's transmission wasn't heard in this movie, it was in a Fortnite event and that's awful. 4. Palpatine's return comes out of nowhere. 5. Palpatine's return negates the arc of the previous two trilogies. 6. Star Destroyers coming out from under ice would damage the ships and thus makes no sense. 7. Where would Palpatine have found resources to build such a fleet in the unknown regions? 8. The new Sith fleet just looks like Star Destroyers from the original trilogy era. 9. Another planet killer is repetitively unoriginal. 10. Kylo Ren rebuilding his mask is a retcon. 11. Lightspeed skipping breaks lightspeed canon. 12. Luke's lightsaber literally looks like it was just strapped back together, an apt metaphor for this film's many retcons. 13. Leia's scenes break believability, are very uncanny valley, and feel forced. 14. Lando just appears deus ex machina from nowhere. 15. Poe's line "they fly now" is laughably dumb and the sentiment is inconsistent with canon. 16. How does the Pasaana quicksand hover suspended over a set of caves? This is illogical. 17. Finn's line "Rey, I never told you" is set up without payoff. 18. Force healing breaks Force canon and cheapens all Star Wars deaths. 19. It makes no sense to carve directions to the Wayfinder on a knife. 20. It's nothing but plot contrivance that C-3PO can't translate the Sith language on Ochi's knife. 21. There is no way the Sith Hunter's ship should still be running due to age, Jawas, etc. 22. The fake-out deaths feel inconsequential. 23. Zori Bliss is useless. 24. The captain's medallion is pure contrivance. 25. There are no stakes in the Star Destroyer heist. 26. There would be no Death Star remnants based on the explosion from Return of the Jedi. 27. The knife shape showing the exact location of the Wayfinder makes no sense given decay over time of the Death Star. 28. Darkseid Rey is nothing but a tease. 29. The Death Star fight is lame. What, Rey just got too tired. 30. Leia's death from too much force is laughable. 31. Luke's characterization is an Episode 8 retcon. 32. Luke's hut in The Last Jedi used a wing from the X-Wing for a door, and with this plus his X-Wing being underwater for 10 years, there is no way his X-Wing would still work. 33. Poe's line "somehow Palpatine returned" is the dumbest line in this film. 34. The line "dark science, cloning, secrets only the Sith knew" is a canon ignorant line. The Sith weren't the only ones who knew how to clone. 35. Horses on a Star Destroyer are dumb and don't make tactical sense. 36. Why were there no allies at Crate, but now suddenly a galaxy of allies are at Exegol? 37. The Resistance ships at Exegol just look like a blob. 38. Palpatine's plan for Rey makes no sense. Does he want to kill her, have her kill him, or suck the life force from her? 39. Palpatine's life force sucking comes from nowhere and breaks canon. 40. The Force diet comes from nowhere and breaks canon. 42. Palpatine's death may not really be final. Who is to say he can't just come back again? 42. Why does Palpatine regenerate with new robes? And why that dumb red? Is he a pimp? 43. Palpatine's rejuvenated form still bears the wounds of Mace Windu from Revenge of the Sith. 44. Giving Chewbacca a medal makes no sense and is either pure fan service or trying to fix a plot hole that wasn't in A New Hope. 45. The Knights of Ren were lame and unexplained. 46. Finn was wasted in this film. 47. The fetch quest nature of the story is like a video game. 48. Rey being a Palpatine is a retcon, and doesn't fit with The Force Awakens, thus feels unfitting. 49. The Last Jedi was clearly setting up Kylo to be the villain of the next episode, thus his redemption is an unnecessary retcon. 50. Rey Skywalker is unearned and feels more like identity theft. Part 5.2. Objections Rebuffed. One of my philosophies is this. If there's an easy answer to something considered a plot hole in a film, whether the answer is from somewhere in the film, somewhere in another connected film, or something that can be easily derived, then the plot hole doesn't hold much weight to me. That's the philosophy I am going to be employing here. Some of my answers will be subjective, but some will be in response to subjective objections, and some objections I will try to rebuff partly here but later partly embrace. I'm also generally addressing these in film chronological order, but I am saving some of the more significant criticisms for the end, so those may appear somewhat out of order. 1. While I don't love the title of this film, The Rise of Skywalker, considering that this film was meant to represent the final film in the Skywalker Saga, and the film's climax to be the end of the Skywalker-Palpatine conflict, I think Rise of Skywalker at least makes sense. This is the rise of the Skywalkers in legacy, purpose, and true meaning, and by inverse this is also the fall of Palpatine, and since Rey adopts the mantle of Skywalker, this is also the rise of Rey into her destiny as a Skywalker. It would have been cooler if Skywalker was the title given to the new Jedi Order, and the film called Rise of the Skywalkers, but alas it was not. Thus the title does make sense in context, and in that context, it works. 2. The first line in the Crawl the Dead Speak is fine. Palpatine was thought dead, and they hear his voice as if he were still alive, so it's like the dead speak. It ain't Shakespeare, but neither is Han Solo's I know, so this complaint feels a little nitpicky. 3. Was Snoke a worthless lead villain, given the Rise of Skywalker revelation that Palpatine made Snoke and that he was nothing more than a placeholder? I don't think so. Having Snoke be a placeholder leader while Palpatine regains strength does explain a lot of why he already seemed like the same character with the same powers and same motivations as Palpatine. It also gives an origin to Snoke and the First Order that serves as a through line for this trilogy and the previous trilogies. Some already accused Snoke of being a Palpatine clone in the rhetorical sense before Episode 9 came out, so this essentially embraces that criticism and makes it literal. Again, I'm not saying this is perfect, but if you wanted a new overarching villain who wasn't Kylo Ren since Snoke was dead, and you wanted to explain the similarities, this does accomplish that purpose. 4. Did Palpatine's return come out of nowhere with no canon precedent? Here is my no answer. The construction of the Death Star is one of the most pivotal moments in the history of the Empire, and it appears to have taken about 18 years to build. But only 5 years after the Battle of Yavin, the Empire has another Death Star. One very plausible theory I endorse here that would explain this, is that Palpatine was always building 2 Death Stars, and the second was a backup. I'm then going to propose here that it isn't too far-fetched that Palpatine would also construct a backup fleet, Empire, and a clone of himself in the unknown regions for the unlikely event of the Empire's demise. Palpatine was clearly a schemer, so introducing schemes for the possibility of his own downfall isn't too far-fetched. Also, if he did this, it is here he probably could reveal things openly that were hidden from the wider galaxy, like his Sith nature and allegiance to the Sith teachings, as well as perform abhorrent experimentation like strand casting to attempt to produce Force-sensitive one. This would explain the Sith Eternal and his wicked Sith experiments, and indeed, something like this has become the new canon explanation for the rise of Palpatine in the Final Order. Additionally, the now non-canon expanded universe had many examples of Palpatine having backup plans not so different than this, so while I'm not saying this is a perfect story idea, as this clearly seems to have no hints or build-up previous in the sequel trilogy, I am arguing it isn't unprecedented in Star Wars lore. 5. Regarding the fleet coming up out of the ice on Exegol, I think it's clear enough that the construction of this Sith fleet was done in secret. It was done in the unknown regions on a hidden planet only accessible via guarded navigation instruments, so it's also plausible that the Star Destroyer construction could have been done underwater to add another layer of secrecy. And given how massively strong Star Destroyer hulls have to be to withstand the pressures of space, as well as laser fire, breaking through the ice probably would do minimal damage if any. Yes, it does seem like something that should have been thought of in advance, that the water may be frozen when construction is complete, and I have no doubt this was solely for cool visuals, but it's still plausible. And it almost makes the Star Destroyers look like they are rising from the grave like an undead resuscitation, just like Palpatine. 6. The concern around lightspeed skipping stems mostly, as I understand, from Han's A New Hope comments where he says, quote, "Without precise calculations we could fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova." Thus Star Wars lore has recognized the need for nav computer calculations before any hyperspace travel, which lightspeed skipping would seem to ignore, as clearly no such calculations are being made before those jumps. But I think lightspeed skipping can still work just fine. Assuming the nav has saved some recent previous calculations, it would essentially be nothing more than jumping to coordinates that the nav computer had already calculated, just very quickly and without additional recalculation. Would this be dangerous? Absolutely. Is this canon breaking? I don't think so. And this is a good example of something that is easy to explain with just some additional thought. Yes, the film doesn't explain this outright. That criticism at least is fair. But while the importance of hyperspace travel to Star Wars makes me grant some sensitivity to treating it flippantly, it's so easy to explain this that I'm fine with it. 7. The Sith fleet just looks like the old Imperial Navy. Yes, it does. I can't argue with that visual fact. But I don't think this is to be problematic. If this was truly the Emperor's backup plan, then they were building based on designs per Imperial specification from that time period. Should they have updated their designs in 30 years? Maybe. But if they were up against no additional threats in the unknown regions, maybe they had no reason to. Yeah, it seems lazy. The background story is that the effects team needed a high-quality model quickly and they had one from Rogue One. Thus it looked like an ISD-2. And while I love new ships, and it makes me sad to not see a whole fleet of previously unseen ships, the logic makes sense both practically and story-wise. 8. Was Kylo Ren rebuilding his mask a retcon of The Last Jedi? I don't think necessarily so. Kylo Ren destroying his helmet in the previous film was in response to shame from Supreme Leader Snoke mocking him wearing, quote, that ridiculous mask, and Kylo Ren destroying it represented his continued vulnerability throughout that film. But even that film closed with his overcoming his masters, and closing the door on those he was vulnerable to. This film clearly sets up that he is now the Supreme Leader, who also leads the Knights of Ren, and is isolated from nearly everyone. Rebuilding the mask seems to fit with that quite well. Sure, director J.J. Abrams could have resented his cool mask being destroyed and decided to bring it back regardless of consequence, but the decision fits with this story, so his motivations for bringing it back don't really matter. And it echoes the motif of healing. Even Kylo is trying to heal, although in the wrong direction, as though he's trying to heal his fractured soul. And this parallels Rey healing her lightsaber that Kylo Ren fractured. And both objects still bear the scars of that conflict. And the mask is just cool looking, made even cooler with all that red from rebuilding it. It's fun to see it again. 9. I've heard a lot of mocking the line, quote, "They fly now." That C-3PO, and Finn exclaimed during the speeder chase on Pasaana. Some seem to think the line just sounded dumb, and I won't argue with that sort of subjectivity here. But others argue this was clear ignorance of Star Wars canon, as jetpacks have been canon in Star Wars all the way back to The Empire Strikes Back. But for that criticism to be true, the "they" who fly now must refer generically to characters in universe, as if Poe and Finn were saying that no one had ever used a jetpack before in the galaxy. But that seems like an unrealistic assumption about who is being referred to. What seems a more logical assumption is that First Order stormtroopers fly now, which had not been seen by our characters or in any film before. This seems so very straightforward that I'm a little surprised by those who endorse this criticism. Another example of something not explicitly said in the film, but the derivation seems almost surface level. And again, I'm not saying this line is Shakespeare, but it's not canon ignorant either. 10. When the team is sinking in quicksand on Pasaana, Finn exclaims, "Rey, I never told you," and then is cut off by being submerged in the quicksand. Twice in the film this unfinished statement is referred to by other characters, but what Finn was going to tell Rey is never revealed in dialogue, and some have criticized this as a plot hole. While I grant that it's possible that perhaps a scene that directly addressed what Finn was referring to may have been cut, it has always seemed clear enough to me what Finn was going to say that it didn't have to be vocalized. Finn can sense the Force. The film hints and demonstrates that Finn is Force-sensitive multiple different times, but it never outright says it. So, Finn is shown to be Force-sensitive but never says it, and Finn has a secret he wants to tell Rey, the only remaining Jedi, but he never says it. This seems like a pretty clear implication, and I think we can and should put 2 and 2 together and infer that this is what Finn was trying to say. 11. How can the quicksand on Pasaana be solid enough to sit suspended above a series of caves but porous enough that the team is pulled under? Well, firstly, this is a fictional universe with all sorts of deltas from our real-world physics. And I don't want to brush past this too quickly because things that differ from our universe are exactly why we watch Star Wars specifically and science fiction in general. Now I should grant that these differences are frequently the very thing that needs the most explanation in order to maintain verisimilitude. Too quickly asserting something just works this way in the galaxy is a quick way to break a viewer's suspension of disbelief. We viewers want to feel a consistency in the universe, the same consistency as exists in ours. But even in our world, we have non-Newtonian fluids whose behaviors are similar. Their density varies based on penetration velocity, so I'd think we could easily imagine an in-universe explanation. Yes, it might have been nice to have this explained beforehand, even a single line, and maybe they meant to, as they called this the Forbidden Valley, and who knows why it was forbidden and what that implies, but the behavior of this quicksand seems a minor enough detail that I'm not sure much explanation is necessary. 12. Does Force healing come out of nowhere and break canon? In some sense, every Force power comes out of nowhere in the films. It doesn't exist until it does. And though this has never been seen in a Star Wars film before, Force healing has been a part of the now non-canon expanded universe for quite some time, and it was simultaneously introduced in The Mandalorian and in this film, so that's not totally out of nowhere. The film does not explicitly explain where Force healing comes from, but no film has explained the exact boundaries around specific Force powers. Previous movies introducing new Force powers didn't have nearly so much back canon to try to reconcile with, but they also did not introduce exact limits to a Force power in their respective films. I know some have asked questions like if Rey can heal, why couldn't previous Jedi heal? For example, Obi-Wan healing Qui-Gon Jinn? Or does Force healing now negate the gravity of wounds and death in future films if there is a Jedi around? And I grant those questions are fair, but in order to answer those questions, I think we'd have to answer a host of other questions such as, Question 1, what is the nature of Force healing? That is it limited to only certain persons or certain times, or could anyone learn it? We don't know if some Jedi have abilities unique to them or unique to a time period. Is it related to the power of a dyad? Question 2. If it's a power that can be learned, how long has it been known? Did the prequel-era Jedi know it, or had it been known and forgotten by then? Did that knowledge get lost during the Great Purge? The film did show Rey studying Jedi texts that had presumably been lost for generations, so it's not impossible she learned something long forgotten. Question 3. What are the limits of Force healing? Could it be used on any wound or only certain types within time limits? As any Force power, it seems fair to assume this one must have limitations. Additionally, if we were to apply this criticism as a consistent standard, I think we would have to require this film and other future films to follow something like one of these 4 paths. Path 1. Require the canon of Force powers be closed. No new Force powers means new Force powers cannot break canon. Path 2. Limit the magnitude of Force powers that can be introduced. No new Force powers would break previous canon because there would be no new Force powers of that magnitude. Path 3. Require films that introduce potential canon-breaking Force powers to explain enough detail to understand they do not break canon. This would be inconsistent with how Force powers have been introduced in previous film canon, but it would prevent future new Force powers from breaking canon. Path 4. Allow films to introduce new Force powers in a way consistent with their story, and give them the benefit of the doubt that it doesn't break canon with room for future explanations. This would be consistent with how current Star Wars film canon has introduced Force powers. I'm actually comfortable with all of these options, but I would be fine with applying option 4 specifically to this movie. Some future film can explain why Force healing doesn't have to be canon-breaking, but there's enough potential answers even here that I'm comfortable kicking that can down the road. 13. Why would Ochi engrave the location to the Wayfinder on a dagger in the runes of the Sith language? Keeping instructions of any type on a dagger seems illogical enough, but add carving them into the dagger and it almost threatens suspension of disbelief. So let me make a half-hearted defense, or at least ask some questions to give some room for doubt. Ochi was established to be working with Sith Eternal, and it is established that these Sith are ritualistic. Specifically, the scenes with Rey at Exegol amongst the Sith Eternal are clearly very ritualistic. Given this, could Ochi have been given this dagger by the Emperor via a Sith ritual? Runes and daggers are frequently associated with cultist rituals in fiction, and the Sith Eternal seemed ritualistically centered around Palpatine, to whom the Wayfinder belonged, and which is now located in his old throne room at the site of his previous demise. Given Ochi's stated occupation as a Sith relic hunter, it's not impossible to think that his commission involved some ritual that would help him get back to Exegol if needed. And it easily makes sense that the Sith would have their own language, especially considering Legends lore where Sith were once a species. It also makes sense to write your instructions in a language that almost no one speaks, and the only ones who still understand are forbidden to translate it. So yes, most of this isn't explained in film, but there's enough imagery that we could assume an answer as to why the instructions were carved into the dagger. 14. Was it arbitrary that C-3PO couldn't read the Sith language written on the knife? If you can accept the idea of the dagger itself, then this one is very straightforward. There are many potential answers consistent with the language being outlawed. Maybe at the time it was outlawed there were still good reasons for droids to be able to read it, but humans could not speak it. Maybe the droid programming patch to outlaw Sith language took a shortcut and just prohibited translating it, and it never removed the ability to read it, aka dead code. I don't know, but it seems easy enough to assume a consistent answer that I don't think we need to know more. 15. Why did the ship that belonged to Ochi the Sith Hunter still run after all that time? Shouldn't it have dry-rotted or been stripped by Jawas or something? Again, this feels like it has some merit, but let me try an answer. The film already referred to this location as the Forbidden Valley, so it's not too much of a stretch that it's not a frequently visited place by the natives. Jawas have only appeared on 2 planets in current film and TV canon, and mainly Tatooine, so it's possible there are no Jawas on this planet. It's also possible that either the Jawas respected the Forbidden Valley, or the natives protected it to some degree, although since Rey and company, Ochi, and the First Order all entered it without local trouble, protection seems less likely. Are there mimic-like creatures that would chew on the power couplings? Are there other Yuwa-like creatures on this planet? We just aren't told. Also, Star Wars spaceships are built to withstand incredible pressures of space travel and atmospheric traversal, and can tank a few laser bolts even without shields, and some ships have done so for decades. The Millennium Falcon, Leia's blockade runner, etc. So it's possible that just sitting for 30 years may be less strenuous than normal use. Are Star Wars ships built to withstand things like dry rotting? Does hyperspace fuel evaporate the same way gasoline will over time? Is Ochi's ship unique in this way and built to withstand long periods of disuse? Again, we simply are not told. I'm not saying these are perfect answers. I'm just arguing it's not impossible and there's not enough canon data to necessitate this being a plot hole. 16. Some have said that the fake-out deaths reduce storytelling credibility and are desensitizing when real deaths actually occur. And while I somewhat agree, death needs to be consequential for stories to have consequence, I will just repeat this. I think the point was less to be fake deaths and more to reinforce the motif of resurrection. The characters die metaphorically and then they come back to life, as Kylo, Rey, and Palpatine die and come back physically. And while both deaths would have been emotional, not even George Lucas wanted to kill the family dog in the last episode, and I doubt this film wanted to do so either. 17. Was Zorii Bliss any more useless than other side characters in Star Wars? She looked kinda cool and helped our heroes along the way by leading them to Babu Frick, encouraging Poe, giving him the captain's medallion, and then joining the fight at the end. Is this any more useless than Boba Fett or the other original trilogy bounty hunters? Than Darth Maul or Zam Wesell? Than Captain Phasma or the Knights of Ren? What else do we want in side characters? 18. Was the captain's medallion mere plot contrivance with no attempted explanation as to why Zorii Bliss has one? Possibly, but I will at least say this. The First Order having some type of access key with privileged access for command staff is well within the realm of believability. Why does Zorii Bliss have one? I'm not really sure this is an explanation the film owes us. Maybe the fact that it appears at the exact moment it's needed with no setup from a character who has no further plot purpose is coincidental beyond believability, but hey, I'm stealing my own thunder from my criticism section. 19. Is having another planet killer, with a big gun strapped onto classic Star Destroyers, repetitive and unoriginal? Sure, kind of, but maybe so was having another Death Star. And Star Killer base. And miniaturized Death Star tech. And don't get me started on the Legends expanded universe, just look up the Galaxy Gun or the Sun Crusher. Additionally, this Palpatine is an insane clone and prone to dumb ideas, but also once you've invented the quote ultimate power in the universe, why wouldn't you use it every chance you get, including in your backup fleet in the unknown regions? Not arguing against unoriginality, just saying it's not inconsistent from a character perspective. 20. There is a complaint that there are no stakes in the Star Destroyer heist to rescue Chewbacca, but I don't think that's really fair. If you accept the premise of the captain's medallion, then you'd have to accept that our heroes start out with the element of surprise, because the First Order is expecting that this incoming ship has privileged access. Maybe it's surprising that such a junky ship has a medallion, but then again look at what the Knights of Ren fly. And after only a few minutes of screen time, the First Order is on high alert and have captured our Resistance friends who only finally escape because of Hux's betrayal and Rey's Jedi skills. Yes, it may never really feel like they are in danger because the sequence moves so quick and is fairly brief, but there are real stakes that are realized, and the First Order should not have been expected to be on high alert, and they respond quickly when the situation escalated. It's fair to complain that our heroes' blasters are always accurate unlike stormtroopers, but this is a Star Wars-wide complaint going back to Return of the Jedi. It may also be fair to complain about films that write scenes this way, but that seems a more subjective "I don't like this" complaint that I won't address here. 21. Another complaint is that there should be no second Death Star remnants on any planet based on the explosion from Return of the Jedi. That Death Star was practically vaporized. But I think this is still unfair. First, the second Death Star being vaporized is not said in any way in Return of the Jedi, nor is it a necessary implication of what is said in the film, nor is it pivotal to the plot in any way. Its sole canonical reference is the visual from that film, and only a momentary visual reference at that. Imagery subsequent to the initial explosion clearly shows chunks drifting in space, which means no vaporization level explosion. Sure, no chunks the size of the one shown in The Rise of Skywalker are seen, but then again, we only get a few seconds of the explosion shown, and even those are an artifact of how the effect was done in 1983. The explosion of the first Death Star showed it essentially vaporized, but again, my same arguments would apply to that. I just don't think that's enough information to base a very serious criticism. And those remnants look so cool in this movie, that alone tempts me to give it a pass. 22. Yes, Ochi's knife is cut into the shape of the Death Star remnants, which shows exactly where the Wayfinder is. I won't spend any more time on why this does or doesn't make sense to do. As I already mentioned, I don't think we know enough about Ochi or the Sith Eternal to say whether or not this was a part of a ritual or some other reason. But I will address this criticism. Some have said this makes no logical sense because the remnants of the Death Star would have decayed over time, and thus would not have retained the shape carved into the knife. But I don't think this is necessarily true. The Death Star is made to exist in the vacuum of space, to withstand laser bombardment of capital ships, and to be able to maintain structural integrity while firing an enormous kyber crystal-powered laser. Also, those chunks are probably enormously heavy and thus probably wouldn't move, and even steel at the bottom of the ocean on our planet keeps its shape and integrity for some years before decay. I don't think it's too unreasonable to think that such an object might not decay noticeably in 30 years in the water. 23. Was it cheap that as the fight between Rey and Kylo Ren over the Death Star remnants progressed, as Kylo Ren's attacks continued, that Rey eventually just got tired and nearly lost? Did she just get sleepy? Did the choreographers just run out of ideas? Here's my opinion, which I already alluded to. This is the first time Kylo has fought Rey at his full strength, and for a long duration, and the fight is meant to show Kylo's clear superiority in lightsaber combat. The only fight between them in 7 is after Kylo has been shot by Chewie's bowcaster and after he murdered his father, thus Kylo had open physical and emotional wounds. In 8, their only fight is a Force conflict over Anakin and Luke's saber, which is interrupted by Admiral Holdo's actions. Rey and Kylo do not lightsaber duel at all in The Last Jedi. And all the fights in this film up until this one are interrupted in some way. Rey flees from their fight in the Forbidden Valley on Pasaana, and Kylo breaks off the dyad fight to meet Rey face to face on his Star Destroyer. When Rey has to fight Kylo in hand-to-hand combat with nothing but the Force and lightsabers, Kylo clearly proves he has the stamina of someone with training, and Rey is essentially no match. Additionally, much like Vader fighting Luke in The Empire Strikes Back, or Dooku fighting Obi-Wan, his apprentice's apprentice in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, Kylo is not fighting to kill. He's fighting to disarm, to prove the superiority of the dark side, and to convince Rey to join him. I think the choreography is designed to show all this, and I think it more or less works. 24. Some say Leia died of overdosing on too much Force, which feels cheap. And while that feels like kind of a crude way to say it, it's not factually wrong. Obviously this is not unprecedented, as this is how Luke met his end in the previous film, although I don't think that alleviates many of the critics' sentiments. So here's another argument. Even from the original trilogy, Force users often walk away from using the Force physically exhausted, which seems to indicate using the Force takes a physical toll on those who use it, especially those with less training. Based on that, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to imagine that a sentient being could use the Force so extensively that they essentially destroy their natural body. And in this film, Leia is certainly far from well-trained. Luke in the previous film, while being well-trained, had been disconnected from the Force for years. Also, Kylo Ren in the previous film believed that Force projection was a type of Force power that came at a tremendous physical cost, stating, quote, "The effort alone would kill you." Some may object to the visual presentation of this, as you can barely see Leia and she appears to just lay down and die, but that's mostly an artifact of the decisions around representing Carrie Fisher, and I discussed that elsewhere. So while some might not like this as a story element, it's not inconsistent with canon, both in this trilogy and the previous two. 25. The line, "Dark science, cloning, secrets only the Sith knew," is not a canon-ignorant line. Beaumont-Kin is not trying to say that dark science and cloning are secrets only the Sith knew. That's a misunderstanding one might make if someone forgot to utilize the Oxford comma. There are three separate things Beaumont-Kin is suggesting may have been used to bring back Palpatine. The first is dark science, the second is cloning, the third is secrets only the Sith knew. This is again an example where the answer seems so easily derived. I'm a little bit surprised to find anyone seriously espousing this criticism. 26. I've heard Poe's line "somehow Palpatine returned" mocked a great deal, although I get the impression more of this as a mockery of the film's setup of Palpatine's return than of this line. And for those who just think it sounds dumb, I won't defend it against that subjective criticism here. But I will say this. Given that Poe has no understanding of how Palpatine returned from the grave, but he knows that Palpatine appears to have done so, simply stating that it happened somehow isn't that odd. I don't think anyone expects Star Wars to be highbrow dialogue. I've heard good arguments that Star Wars dialogue has always been purposefully a bit on the nose. The fact that the film wants to just wave its hand and have us believe Palpatine just returned somehow is a problem, and I think a lot of the mockery has been as a surrogate for mocking the plot, and the ex machina return which just happened somehow, but Poe's line itself is fine in its own context. 26. Did Palpatine have a schizophrenic plan to deal with Rey? First he sent Ochi to kidnap her as a child, then he tells Kylo to kill her, then he tells Rey he never wanted her dead but to be Empress, then he tells Rey to kill him so his soul can inhabit her body or something. Again, he's an insane clone, his plans are insane. In seriousness, I think there is a lot of this type of criticism in film that seems to fail to understand that villains adjust their schemes based on circumstances just like the good guys. I'm going to walk through how I understand his plan in stages and try to show how his plan makes sense as it would have evolved. Stage 1. Given Palpatine was strand casting trying to create Snoke-like Force-sensitive beings, it's fair to assume he was cloning himself in the same effort, which produced his son. At some point later, his clone son had a daughter, Rey, who was Force-sensitive, and thus Palpatine wanted her and hired Ochi. Why did Palpatine want her? To try to clone her? To inhabit her? To turn her to the dark side? Any of those could be true, or all of them. It doesn't matter, his plan would be to capture her. Stage 2. When we first meet Palpatine at the beginning of this film, Palpatine has been successful in creating at least one Force-sensitive clone in Snoke. Snoke has trained and been killed by Kylo Ren, who Palpatine thinks he can use to either inhabit, or to serve him. And Rey is a servant of the light and a disciple of Luke Skywalker. Thus Rey is a threat, and he has no need for her, so he orders Ren to kill her. Stage 3. When Rey finally faces Palpatine on Exegol, why wouldn't he just finish his plan and kill her then? Several things have changed. Palpatine has lost Kylo to the light. Rey knows she is a Palpatine. Rey is being tempted by the dark side. Rey has found Palpatine on Exegol. Although the last one may seem obvious, let's not rush past it. His granddaughter Rey, who he previously sought after, and who is now actively being tempted by the dark side, is now right in front of him. Why not try to tempt her to the dark side? Yes, he could kill her and continue using Snoke clones, but before him is a potential apprentice far younger and more powerful and of his own flesh and blood. And he could always kill her if this failed. Now, did he want her to be Empress or did he want to pass his essence into her? Pretty sure only the latter, but that's not exactly what you tell the person you are trying to lure to the dark side to strike you down. It could also be argued there are two different plans of attack. Tempt her to the dark side directly by the offer of becoming Empress, then tempt her to the dark side through revenge by striking him down. But since I hate essence transfer stories, I choose to believe this clone was insane and the essence transfer would never have worked, but regardless I think this Palpatine more or less has the same plan from the beginning. Find individuals that he can train and or pass his essence into, and his plan only alters with differences in circumstances. And this is all in the film, one way or another. 27. Palpatine wore red robes when he regenerated because he wore them in Episode 3, that's all. Should his regeneration have given him new clothes? Maybe, maybe not. The whole regeneration power is very unclear. Although this is just a minor visual detail and I'm not sure I really care that much. He should have regenerated to look like his prequel self, not his Return of the Jedi self, but anyway. 28. Why does the fleet of little ships appear ex machina style to save the Resistance at Exegol when there were no allies to save them at Crate? Because they didn't have Lando at Crate. In seriousness, this is kind of the whole point. One of the Last Jedi's themes was that the Resistance is, as Poe said, the spark that will light the fire that will burn the First Order down, but by Crate, even Leia says the spark is out, and it was only Luke Skywalker's heroic sacrifice that rekindled the spark of galactic resistance. Poe's arc as a leader in this film culminates in his realization that good people will follow if the Resistance lead, and because of the rekindled spark and the leadership exhibited by Poe and the Resistance, the galaxy has indeed risen up to ensure that the yoke of an empire under Palpatine will never return. Yes, because we don't see the fleet being assembled and because the effort to recruit the galaxy isn't a plot element in this story, it feels a bit like they came out of nowhere. But it is explained in the planning session that Lando was going on a recruiting mission, and it's very consistent with what the story is trying to say. The fleet appears this time because Poe, Luke, and the Resistance gave the galaxy hope. 29. Another complaint is that the horses on the Star Destroyer are ridiculous and tactically nonsensical. But here's my counter-argument: the Resistance is, and has been, low on resources since the beginning of the first sequel film. We've not seen or heard anything about resembling ground assault vehicles outside of the speeders on Crate. Only seen starfighters, bombers and capital ships. Horses from Endor. Finn had spoken to the ex-stormtroopers on Endor already and found common ground with their defection from the First Order. Why not use their horses and deploy them like infantry? And the main reason they deployed on top of a Star Destroyer is because the navigation tower signal was rerouted from a tower on the ground to a tower on the lead Star Destroyer at the last second. This also continues to echo one of George Lucas's themes of asymmetric warfare. So all around I think this one makes enough sense. 30. They give Chewbacca the medal that Leia had earlier in the film, which was almost certainly Han's medal from A New Hope. It's not pandering or mere fan service. They didn't just randomly give him a medal. Yes, giving him a medal was a wink to Chewbacca not getting one on Yavin, but Leia was clearly holding that medal throughout this film as she was remembering Han, so Maz gave it to Leia's next of kin. And this is another way Leia's presence is felt throughout the film without having Carrie Fisher present. 31. I've heard the argument that The Last Jedi set up Kylo to be the main villain of its subsequent episode, and his redemption in The Rise of Skywalker via the inclusion of Palpatine is a retcon. This is some merits, I'll argue. For later, although this defense may initially sound like embracing this criticism. Episode 7 clearly set up that Kylo Ren was a young man torn between dark and light. Though he killed his father trying to reject the light, this only further split his conscience as Snoke perceived. Kylo spared his mother from dying by his own hand, and although even she thought he was too far gone with no possibility of return, as she said on Crate, his former master Luke Skywalker believed that, quote, "no one is ever really gone." Nearly every time until the end of The Last Jedi, whenever Rey asks Kylo to join her and reject the dark, Kylo appears to be torn. Both films have set up that Kylo continues to be a conflicted character, pulled towards the light and the dark, and many characters in both previous films believe that he was not beyond redemption. However, after destroying his master Supreme Leader Snoke, when Kylo had every opportunity to reject the First Order, he still chose to attempt to destroy the Resistance. The same is true when Kylo Ren finally faced Luke Skywalker again. He rejected even the possibility of redemption. This is why the imagery of Rey literally closing the door on him in their last Force dyad scene in The Last Jedi does seem to imply that she has closed the door on him forever. When the story presents Kylo Ren with at least 3 clear opportunities to reject the dark and embrace the light, he embraces the dark of his own volition. However, Episode 8 established a precedent in clarifying what ramifications from the previous episode meant. We know that killing his father only further split Kylo, not because of that film, but because of the next film. Likewise, although the physical rift between Kylo and Rey, as Starkiller Base is torn apart in The Force Awakens, seems symbolic of the permanent relational rift between these two, The Last Jedi draws the two even closer as they try to pull each other towards the light and the dark. So I'm not sure there's anything so conclusive in either preceding film to definitively conclude that Kylo is lost, and it's fair that the next film clarifies the ramifications of the previous film. Additionally, although this isn't really an argument, Disney was always going to redeem this character. They were never gonna let Kylo just be evil and die. Plus it's a grand Star Wars tradition to see characters redeemed, and I can't hate that. 32. And lastly, the complaint that Rey is no Skywalker by blood, nor adoption, nor has she done anything to deserve that, by name or title, and that her intrusion into the Skywalker story makes her calling herself Rey Skywalker feel more like stolen identity than anything else. And I think this criticism belongs at the end because it really is a microcosm of complaints against this entire trilogy. This is a payoff to everything set up in her entire journey throughout these 3 films. I suspect you cannot vehemently dislike this ending without feeling similarly about the setup for this payoff, that being Rey's story throughout the trilogy. Throughout this trilogy, Rey's character arc has revolved around finding her identity, and specifically through lineage. Though she has spent years waiting for her biological family when we meet her in The Force Awakens, it is Leia and Han Solo, daughter of Anakin Skywalker and her husband, who are quick to take her in. Later, although initially reluctant, it's Luke Skywalker who begins her training in the ways of the Force and who helps her save the Resistance by sacrificing himself. And it's Leia who completed Rey's Jedi training, and it's Leia's final sacrifice that saves Rey's life from death at the hands of Kylo Ren. And it's Ben Solo, grandson of Anakin Skywalker, with whom the Force has connected her as a dyad, who she gives her life to redeem. And though Rey discovers her true lineage is descended from Emperor Palpatine, it is against that Emperor, who the Skywalkers defeated so many years ago, that she fights, with the help of Skywalkers past and present, before the last of the Skywalkers gives his life to restore hers. And by joining with the Skywalkers against Palpatine, she abandons the legacy of her biological family to be a part of the legacy of the Skywalkers. So when Rey decides to embrace a last name of her own volition, a name reflecting her lineage, whose would she choose? Her wicked grandfather or the family who took her in, trained her, and sacrificed themselves to save her? I think it's a fitting end for her journey to embrace that legacy, which is the legacy of the Star Wars saga. Skywalker. Part 5.3. Fair Objections. The following are objections to this film that I think are fair. Since I suspect most listeners are familiar with these criticisms, I won't linger too long on these, I'll just mention them and why I agree. And again, some of these are things I have defended previously, so this is the other half of that bifurcation. 1. While still in line with the film's themes, The Rise of Skywalker is far from a perfect title. Specifically and grammatically, Skywalker isn't a singular thing that can rise, like democracy or malevolence. It's a proper name. Rise of Skywalkers would have made more sense, especially if the name of the new Jedi was to be Skywalkers, or at least Rise of the Skywalkers. But the Rise of Skywalker can feel awkward. 2. Palpatine's transmission across the galaxy that was mentioned in the opening crawl but wasn't heard in this movie at all was in a Fortnite event instead. That's a pretty weird decision. It's a half-decent speech anyway, and it should have been in this movie. 3. The Sith Eternal Fleet does just look like they used leftover props from Rogue One, and it would have been much cooler to have new or modified designs. It does feel a bit cheap, like the design team just ran out of time and ideas. 4. Yes, Palpatine's return really does feel like it comes from nowhere. Not taking back previous comments that it solves a number of narrative problems, but it's hard to argue with a complaint that there was no foreshadowing of this event, because there was none. Which is no doubt why it comes across as a shameless, nostalgia-baiting, emergency retcon to make this film and trilogy work. Not saying those things are true, just saying I understand the sentiment. 5. How did Palpatine establish enough resources in the unknown regions within 30 years to build up a fleet so large it could single-handedly win the war? I suppose the implication is that Palpatine was sending resources to establish this even while he was alive, and then some of the Imperial remnants retreated to build this as well, but it still seems to stretch credulity a bit. It'd be as if Nazis fled to Brazil and within 30 years they had resources, facilities, and troops enough to conquer the world. Not impossible, but seems implausible. At least Knights of the Old Republic has them discovering the Star Forge to explain this. 6. I have always hated soul transfer stories, and this is no exception. Stories need consequence and thus they need endings, and the idea that one can just transfer their soul elsewhere takes away the most serious consequence and ending, death. Was Palpatine truly dead after 6? Apparently he transferred the soul or his essence, so no. Is he truly dead after 9? The film doesn't give a more definitive answer, like saying this is how we kill his soul or we've destroyed every clone body like Dark Empire did, so who can say? This is why I endorse the insane clone theory. This Palpatine just thinks he has the same soul. He don't. 7. While I kind of like the idea that this trilogy is about destroying what remained unaddressed from the last war, and Palpatine's backup plan is the embodiment of this, the idea that Palpatine wasn't actually dead after Episode 6 does really make Vader's sacrifice feel a little cheaper. This is lessened if he is an insane clone of Palpatine, but I'm still sympathetic to those who feel like this makes Vader's redemption vain. 8. Yes. The beginning of this film is a fetch quest story. I still think it's mostly a fun romp, but it is MacGuffin after MacGuffin. 9. Finn's story arc is greatly reduced in this film, especially compared to the previous 2 films. While his arc does continue from Stormtrooper, to Rebel, to General in this movie, that promotion feels minor, not set up, and kind of unearned, as it's only mentioned in one line very briefly. And while his defection from the First Order is mirrored by Jenna and her company's defection, and it's Finn who by implication recruits them to fight with their horses against the Final Order, those are also only minor story points, and even that recruitment is implied, not shown. It seems the idea that Finn's defection led to more First Order mutinies was abandoned, which I find sad, as this would have felt like a more complete story arc for the ex-Stormtrooper. It also would have been interesting to explore how Finn felt fighting against the same force he was raised with as a child. I wouldn't take him out, I still enjoy him in the film, and his contributions are not negligible. Finn's First Order expertise and force sensitivity is what grounds the Final Order fleet on Exegol, which enables their final defeat, and it's Finn who recruits Jenna and company to fight, and as a Force sensitive it's probably a fair assumption that he would be the first of the new Jedi Ray trains. But I still wish his arc was more substantive. 10. The Knights of Ren, although actually present in this film, not just mentioned by name, still don't do much and are still unexplained. Are they Force users? Are they ex-Jedi from Luke's academy? Are they some other mysterious group of warriors that Kylo Ren took leadership over? I think the new canon attempts to explain some of this, but that is irrelevant to this discussion. This film spends no time explaining them, they don't do much, and then they are killed off. It seems like they could have been very interesting as Force wielders who followed Ben in his defection from Luke's academy, so this feels like wasted potential. 11. This film gives no background information about what happened to the Republic post-Return of the Jedi, or who the Resistance are in relation to the New Republic. There is enough supplementary information in new canon books, as well as hints from these films, to put together a mostly satisfying answer, but it's a bit frustrating that none of this was explored in the films. And I don't mean in depth, just a few lines from some character to explain what happened would be enough for me. This is really a failure of the first film, as the burden of setting up a new trilogy connected to the old trilogy should fall on the first film, but if that had been an aim of this film, they did not accomplish it. 12. Why carve the location of the Wayfinder into a knife? Is that a Sith eternal ritual or is that something else? How and why was Ochi working with Palpatine? Why were Rey's parents on Ochi's ship at all? These events seem strange enough that an explanation would have gone a long way. 13. While I grant that it's possible that Ochi's ship could still be running after all that time, it's such a standard assumption that things left alone deteriorate in almost every fictional universe that this one feels like an oversight. It should have been explained at least in a line of dialogue or tweaked to make it more clear. 14. Even though I think the fake-out deaths were meant to echo the motif of death and resurrection, I understand the sentiment that they feel like they undercut their own impact. The reveal that Chewie and C-3PO aren't dead happens so quickly after their death, that the impact barely feels like it has set in. And when it happens twice in a row, it can start to feel cheap. I think a lot of this probably could have been mitigated by adding more time and impact before the reveal that they are not dead. Maybe that would have better served feeling like a death and resurrection. 15. The Captain's Medallion, while not entirely implausible, has no setup or precedent and essentially appears the moment it is needed, so it feels ex machina. I think this, combined with the fast pace of the Star Destroyer heist, and how quickly the film moves from Jimmy to the Star Destroyer, that makes it feel like there are no stakes, and that our trio can just barge in guns blazing with no consequence. It isn't true at a plot level, but it can feel true. 16. The idea that Poe knows how to do things, like hotwire a car and lightspeed skip etc., being attributed to what Finn calls shifty stuff, feels silly. I get that they are trying to set up that Poe was a spice runner to advance the motif that your past doesn't define you, but the actual things Poe does don't seem that odd for a member of a covert operation like the Resistance, which makes this thread feel silly and forced. 17. Darkseid Rey was kinda cool for the 30 seconds she was on film. But it feels like a big tease with little significance. 18. Having another planet killer in the Ziston-class Star Destroyers feels repetitive. I think there's good reason it's canonically acceptable. It just feels like the one more super weapon, and with no setup before this film, which then feels cheap and repetitive. 19. It's basically impossible to reconcile that one of the X-Wing's wings was Luke's outdoor in The Last Jedi, and that it just magically works in this film. I liked the scene, but it's a plot hole from the last film. 20. The ships at Exegol really did feel like a big blur. It would have been cool to focus on a few ships we hadn't seen before or hadn't seen in live action, but that probably means they would have had to spend extra time to work on detailed models, and production time was something this film didn't have. 20. I'm not sure if there's any way to portray attacking a Star Destroyer on horseback and it not look a bit silly, so I understand why some didn't like this. I already talked about why this makes decent tactical sense, but even that was not directly explained in this film, nor is it shown in film exactly where the horses come from, so I also forgive those who feel like they come out of nowhere and aren't tactically explained. 21. I hate soul transfer and life force sucking in any film I see it, and I hate it here. I really don't like it. It takes away the consequence of death. You can just transfer your soul somewhere else, which makes almost any consequence in film diminished. But again, if Palpatine was an insane clone, he can have an insane idea that he received Palpatine's soul and that the soul transfer would work with Rey too. That's my headcanon. 22. Nothing Palpatine does in this film feels like the clever, conniving villain of the previous two trilogies. I'm not saying his actions are entirely implausible, I'm just saying he feels more like a cackling bad guy from a cartoon, or an insane clone. 23. Why does Palpatine look like his Return of the Jedi Mace Windu scarred self after sucking the life force out of the dyad? He really should have looked like his pre-Windu fight self, and I suspect this is just so he can still look like his evil Return of the Jedi self. Seems like a visual plot hole. 24. Rey's new yellow lightsaber she made from her staff is so cool looking. I almost wish she could have built one during her training, instead of using the repaired one. Could have hit even more parallels to Luke in Return of the Jedi too. Yes, Luke's original lightsaber looked like it's just strapped back together, with no real explanation as to how, but it's almost a visual nod to healing, as though maybe she used the Jedi texts to learn how to heal the crystal. But that is unexplained in this film. 25. It does feel like a bit of a retcon that The Last Jedi set up Kylo Ren to be the main villain and unredeemable, and then Palpatine has to be the big bad guy so Kylo can find redemption in this film. I made this argument both ways earlier, so here I will just say I'm sympathetic to those who feel like this decision in 9 is counter to the implied direction at the end of 8. 26. This movie does not at all deal with the fate of the Jedi Order. It's not even implied that Rey starts a training school or takes in Finn as an apprentice. Maybe this is trying to emulate Return of the Jedi, or maybe they wanted to save this for a future film, but I want to know what happens to the Jedi. 27. While I think the introduction of Palpatine solves a number of story problems all by itself, what we end up with because of this is a very lopsided trilogy. If both the First Order and Snoke were Palpatine's backup plan, then it feels a bit strange that we should spend 2 films focusing exclusively on what is essentially his first wave, without ever even hinting that Palpatine is still alive, or that there may be a final order, or that there is a whole Sith army elsewhere, and then reveal all those things in the last film. This is certainly an artifact of the filmmakers never planning to introduce Palpatine, but a consequence of this decision is that really does make Snoke's role feel diminished. Making Kylo Ren the main villain of this film would have avoided this problem, it's true, but it may not have solved the issues discussed earlier, and it's pure speculation on what could have been. 28. Did the sequels end up too much like the original trilogy? I will rely on others for the comparisons of the first 2 films of this trilogy to the first 2 films of the original trilogy. But in this film and Return of the Jedi, the nature of the endings present undeniable similarities, a spaceship battle by a small band of rebels against the Emperor and his new superweapon, which turns into the rebels being massively outnumbered, and their defeat can only be prevented if the Last Jedi and the Emperor's underling, who has turned against him and is now fighting the Emperor, destroy him before he intervenes to end the spaceship battle, which is clearly visible from his throne. And this final film and the final battle against the Emperor is a fight for the soul of the Dark Disciple family member of the good guys, who sacrifices his life to save our main protagonist. It's a very similar conclusion in those ways, and it doesn't help those who felt this whole trilogy was an original trilogy rehash. 29. While I like the plot-level idea that this trilogy is now about destroying the Emperor's remnants and his backup plan, and I like the theme throughout this film of rebirth, These two do not feel strongly connected. One could argue that the Empire is going to be reborn if the Resistance doesn't destroy this backup plan, but that feels a bit like a stretch. It wouldn't surprise me if some felt like these two are at odds with each other, and it would have been much more elegant to end the trilogy and saga with both of these themes dovetailing some way. I'm not interested in speculating how to do this, I'm just commenting that these two pieces don't fit together very well. Part 6, Conclusion. So was The Rise of Skywalker a perfect and glorious ending to the sequel trilogy and to the Skywalker Saga? No, I think there's too much merit in some of the criticisms to call it that. And even what the film accomplished sometimes feels a bit rushed and forced. It's definitely the Return of the Jedi or the Dark Knight Rises of this trilogy. But was it a strong attempt to bring the trilogy together and to bring this trilogy and the Skywalker Saga to a close? I think we can call it that. There's a lot that I can enjoy and respect about what the film accomplished and even what it intended to do but didn't quite accomplish, especially in light of the decisions that came before and the very short amount of time the filmmakers had. And I thought the film was fun, and looked and sounded great. So in the end, I do think The Rise of Skywalker deserves more credit than it gets.